Thank you very much, and thank you for this good legal introduction to what we've been working on in the Commission with our American friends. We had a big problem that we had to resolve, because the safe harbor was indeed a structure that showed weaknesses long before the decision of the European Court of Justice in the Schrems case. We've known for a while that the system was too static, very much like other adequacy decisions which have been taken on the basis of the 95 directive, and the references to the articles were made. Because we looked at that in the past, and if you remember in the year 2000, we looked at privacy in general in a totally different way compared to what how we look at privacy and digital commerce and data flows in general. We look at this in a very different way today from there. We looked at the adequacy decision at a certain point in time. We made an assessment of a country and the level of protection in that country, and then we put it in the shelves and we didn't look at it again. That can't be the future anymore. And by the way, in the data protection reform, which is now in the official journal and which will enter into force in May 2018, the chapter 5 on international transfer, which is all about allowing data flows and not about prohibiting data flows, it's very clear that adequacy decision will have to be reviewed regularly, not annually like you do it with a shield, but regularly. It can't be the past where we simply put it in the shelf. That's over. So that was a big problem that we had with the safe harbor to start with. The other big problem was that the commitments which the parties, the companies which benefited from the safe harbor, that they were not clear enough and that they were not monitored enough. It was too lax. It is a self-regulatory system, and the European Court of Justice has, and this was highlighted, not said in the Schrems ruling, that you can't have self-regulatory systems, but they have to be monitored effectively. So we had issues to deal with long before the Schrems ruling, and we started dealing with them, as was said. We have, right after the Snowden revelations, made 13 recommendations how to address the weaknesses of the safe harbor, and we started immediately negotiating. But we got pretty much stuck with our American friends in these negotiations because they were not taken very seriously on their side, especially when it comes to access from the public administration to data that kind of travels over the Atlantic. And it was only thanks to the judgment of the European Court of Justice in the Schrems ruling that we got that opening that was referred to by the pre-speaker, that there was a real commitment from the American side to explain, to be very transparent about their practices on mass surveillance, and to explain to us the safeguards, the limitations that they have built in the Obama administration. I was personally, as was said, very involved, I still am, very involved in this negotiating process, and I can tell you I know much more about the US surveillance systems than I know about the surveillance systems in my own country, and that's Germany. So, I know quite a lot. This has been a process of approximation. I very much support what the pre-speaker has said. This has been a process of approximation of the systems that exist on both sides of the Atlantic, which, and here I would counter a little bit the argument made by my pre-speaker, are not so different. Yes, we have the Charter, we have data privacy as a fundamental right, we have the best 21st century data protection regime that exists, that many people in the world are looking at as a model. The Americans don't. The Americans have, very specific privacy legislation to protect children, to protect the health sector, but they don't have an overarching privacy legislation. And there are a lot of people in the US system who would like to have it, but it's very difficult to get to legislation in the US system. But on the other hand, we have understood each other quite well in this process, and we have understood that if we don't manage to bridge our differences and to approximate our systems more, we will not have TTIP, we will not have data flows, and we will not facilitate what the companies on both sides of the Atlantic need, data flows. I would also make one additional point. We just 2 weeks ago signed in Amsterdam at the last EU-US Justice and Home Affairs Ministerial the first ever binding international agreement on data protection. It's a bit unnoticed because it's in a very specific area. It's in the area of law enforcement. It's the umbrella agreement, but it is of utmost relevance when we are talking about the fight against terrorism, and it's very important to talk about this after the events that we had over the last couple of days. This will facilitate what is happening already today, that law enforcement authorities on both sides of the Atlantic are exchanging data all the time to chase criminals, to kind of, be prepared, to have quick responses. But for the first time, we have high level of data protection standards that both sides are bound by. So this is an international agreement. And this is just the first sign that we can kind of come together in terms of approximating our approaches. What have we achieved in the Shield and where are we? The Shield is indeed, as was said by the pre-speaker, a huge progress compared to the Safe Harbour. If I address the weaknesses that I mentioned earlier, instead of having a static system, we have a very dynamic system. We have agreed that we would do annual joint reviews. These joint reviews will include all the actors. And here comes an important point. This Shield can only work if the actors involved in it on both sides make it work. This includes on our side the data protection authorities, of course the companies. On their side, on the US side, the enforcement authorities, that's the Department of Commerce, that's the FTC, but that's also Department of State, that's also the ODNI in the White House. So we have a lot of actors. We will have to come together to kind of, put questions on the table, get the answers, be transparent about it. We will do reports every year so that the Parliament can kind of look at it again, that the member states can look at it again. This will be a momentum to keep up the pressure so that the reform steps that we have been seeing in the Obama administration, the PPD 28, the Freedom Act, all the kind of executive steps that have been taken in the US system are cemented and are even improved further. And if we don't get good answers, or if we have a next administration that is not bound by it, then we will apply what we have in the adequacy decision, the suspension clause. And then it will be suspended. So that's a quite dynamic process. What have we got in terms of the weaknesses of the Shield, in terms of the monitoring? We have a totally different system of effective monitoring by the enforcers. The FTC and the Department of Commerce have made a huge effort in being better equipped to actually control the companies which will benefit from the Shield. It's easy to get under the Shield, but you have to substantially prove that you deserve to stay under the Shield. And that will be done in this enforcement activity. What else have we achieved? There was a weakness in terms of having clarity on what happens when you have public administration wanting to have access for national security purposes. As was said, we have received a very transparent description of the limitations and the safeguards that the Obama administration has put in after the Snowden revelations to counter the argument of Mr. Schrems and others that there was mass indiscriminate surveillance. What is in the letter of the ODNI, what we have been reassured of, is that the rule is targeted collection of data instead of bulk collection of data, that there are safeguards and limitations built in. Yes, we don't have legislation everywhere, but whoever knows of you, the American system knows very well that executive limitations are part of the business in the US. It's not always Congress deciding, it's a lot of power to the executive to limit it. And I think if we kind of can substantiate these limitations in the annual review, this is a very good progress. But we have to make it work and we have to see whether it's alive. Where are we in the process to finish? We have taken good note of the various good pieces of work that has come our way. This is the Working Party 29 opinion, which is, and I want to stress that, not legally binding, but which is of course, an expert view that we take very seriously also because they are our arms. They are our executive branch when it comes to data protection in general. They will be the ones enforcing the new data protection rules, and they will also be our partners in making the Shield work. We have also taken note of the EDPS opinion, and we have taken good note of the European Parliament resolution of late May. We are in very close contact with the Article 31 committee, that's the member states, and they have been kept informed of everything we've been doing ever since we have issued the draft adequacy decision after the Commission has taken its political responsibility in February and said, this is it, and now we go out in the comitology procedure and defend the Shield. And we have identified some very important remarks which were made in these various pieces, in particular the remarks on the Ombudsperson mechanism, and I would like to pause a little bit on that, the remarks which were made on the bulk collection of data and on data retention. These are three areas that we have been working on intensely over the last couple of weeks, and we are still doing. And when I'm going away, we are having another phone call, so we are still discussing further, but we're making good progress. The Working Party 29 has also given us some good advice on how we could beef up our adequacy decision even further. So there's also some work that we are doing ourselves on the adequacy decision. We're hoping to have this material ready around the end of the week, or at the latest early next week. The Article 31 committee comes together twice in the next days. There's one meeting on the 20th and there's another meeting on the 29th. We hope to be as ready as possible on the 20th. We hope to provide them with the new material either before or shortly thereafter. The key moment for the Article 31 committee will be the 29th of June, where we expect them to vote. And we expect them to vote very much in favor. I don't want to say now, is it unanimity or will there be one abstention? We also had abstention in the data protection reform, but we need a qualified majority, and I'm very positive that we will get that. And then, following comitology, the adequacy decision will come back to the college and watch the space on the 5th of July. That's, I think, the moment where the college will then take the final political decision on the adequacy decision, and then it can get up and running. The Ombudsperson mechanism, just to pause for a second on that. That's quite an important element, and since it wasn't mentioned explicitly by my pre-speaker, I just want to stress that. Because on national security, on surveillance, as I said, we got a lot of description to argue that there is not mass indiscriminate surveillance in the US. But what we also wanted to assure, because we have a key criterion for a substantially equivalent system of protection in the US compared to us, that you need to have access to justice. That's Article 47 of the Charter. So we wanted to have a redress mechanism. We, in our member states, when it comes to national security matters, have very limited redress mechanisms, by the way. But we have, with the Americans, agreed, and that's historic, on an administrative redress mechanism, the Ombudsperson mechanism, which is in the State Department, at a very high level, where we got assurances that an individual that feels, that wants to know that data that has been transferred over the Atlantic, and that might be accessed for national security purposes, which is not a problem, which also for the court is not a problem, because it happens all the time, because we need to be safe. But that this individual has the possibility to challenge whether the rules which apply for such an access have been followed. And in the Ombudsperson mechanism, this mechanism is ensured. The Ombudsperson will make sure that the independent inspector generals in the agencies look into that the Ombudsperson gets a report. And on the basis of that report, the Ombudsperson can give a reply to the individual. This is something groundbreaking and historic. We have to make it work. At the moment it's on paper and it hasn't been tested. And that's what we have to show in the next years. And that's what we are going to defend also in court, if ever this is challenged. And that will be a strong case. But I just want to stress that this is historic, because we don't have such a system in any of our member states. And I think that's something that we should pause on and see as an important step in transatlantic relations. If you want to have my vision on where I see us going in data flows transatlantically in 10 years' time, I'm very much on the Buttarelli line of what he said in his EDPS opinion, that in the long run, it would be better to benefit from the experience of the umbrella agreement, and also for commercial data flows, try to approximate our visions even further, and not close the door for one day to have an international agreement between the EU and the US to govern our commercial data flows for good. Thank you very much.